to our last stop in his journey to a better understanding of Israeli politics and society. As you may remember, our historical point of departure in this course was the emergence of the Zionist movement in Europe and its role in shaping Israeli state and society today. However, the Zionist movement itself has chosen a different point of departure, one that goes back 2,000 years to the kingdoms of David and Solomon. It goes back to the first Jewish kingdom to control the territory to which the Zionist movement has strived to return. A kingdom that was built around its capital, Jerusalem or Zion. Tracing the roots of the Jewish nation back to the glorious time of King David and King Solomon, when the 12 tribes were still united and when, according to Jewish tradition, the nation had thrived, has provided a historical legitimacy for the Jewish people's claim for the right to the territory. In a world in which nations' right to self-determination in a specific territory must be grounded in a historical affiliation with the land, the dream to return to their ancestors' land and to its capital, Jerusalem, has sparked the imagination and the enthusiasm of Jews around the globe and has instigated the political support of other Bible readers for this national project. Indeed, the Zionist movement has managed to come back to Jerusalem and established its modern capital on the ruins of King David's capital. The myth of King David's Jerusalem still inspired Jews to come to Jerusalem, and the archaeological and geographical debates about the history of the city still inform many of the geopolitical struggles in the Middle East. Members of all three monotheistic religions state their historical right to the city and their commitment to fight to the death to secure their control over the city. Jerusalem today is therefore a microcosmos of Israeli society on the one hand, and of the Middle East on the other. It is a home for ultra-Orthodox, Orthodox and secular Jews, as well as Muslims and Christians. It is the home of the Israeli governing apparatuses such as the Knesset, the Prime Minister office, the President's home, and all other ministries. It is the place where ancient meets modern in every corner, where poverty meets great wealth, and where emotions are always close to the surface. It is also the home of our university, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. It is because of this historical and mythological significance, its importance in understanding Israel's culture and its place in the Middle East, that I've chosen to conclude our journey with a talk about Jerusalem. Historical geographer Ronnie Ellenblum will guide us on this tour of Jerusalem, both ancient and new. Elnblum is a professor at the Department of Geography here at the Hebrew University. He is specializing in the geography, history, and archaeology of the Crusades, and in urban geographical history as well as environmental history. He is the author of numerous books and articles covering the historical geography of the region with a special interest in Jerusalem. Together with Professor Sari Nusseibeh of Al-Quds University, he initiated the Jerusalem Library as part of the Historic City Research Project.
Shalom. I was asked to present Jerusalem, the place of Jerusalem in the Israeli society, and probably not only in the Israeli society, but elsewhere as well. And it is difficult to explain the meaning of Jerusalem for the Israeli society. And actually I tried several years ago. I was tried to convene together here in Mount Scopus some of the people who are identified with the idea of Jerusalem and to ask them the question, what is the meaning of Jerusalem for them? There were many people. There was Palestinian people, Muslim people, Christian people, Jewish people, Haredi people, settlers and left wings, whatever. And I was trying to interview them and to find out what is the meaning of Jerusalem for them. And I found that Jerusalem is several different things for different people. For very modernist people, Jerusalem is just a city, is an area in the midst of Israel. It is something that can be managed, divided, looked upon. It is something. It is a kind of a real estate, a big real estate, an important one, but a real estate. I think this was the way that some of the politicians in Israel looked at Jerusalem and still regard it as something that can be managed in such a way. For many people, religious people, Jerusalem, and it was quite sad for me because I'm also a modernist, for many of the religious people, no matter of which religion, Jerusalem is not real estate. It's not a manageable piece of land. It is an idea. It is, and if asked to define it geographically, it's a spot. It's a singular spot. It is something which is a Euclidean dot, something that cannot be divided. Something which is dear to them. It is the gates of heaven. It is the place. It's the idea of the connection between the God and humanity. And I learned a lot from this series of interviews that I made here, and together with you. I would like to try and define and to very briefly to understand the meaning or the changing meaning of Jerusalem for all three religions, all three monotheistic religions, and what happened to them in the last 150 years, influencing the Israeli society, the Palestinian society, and probably the entire world as well. How do we start? If we start with the Jewish way of defining Jerusalem, the Jewish way of defining Jerusalem is to identify Jerusalem with the destruction of the first temple, the destruction of the second temple, the destruction of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is celebrated for many centuries. It is celebrated as a kind of a memory. It became a kind of a memory for the Jews. We Jewish people remind Jerusalem during the Passover feast. We remember Jerusalem during our marriages and so on and so forth. Jerusalem is identified with its destruction. And actually the entire Bible can be read as a way of preparing the reader for the destruction of Jerusalem and the description of the destruction itself. A big part of the Bible are kind of prophecies and things that lead to the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. So the destruction of Jerusalem is a very important meaning in the history of the Jewish people and the identity and the self-identity of the Jewish people for many, many years. And it is true. I cannot think about other surviving city of antiquity that was destroyed, conquered, resettled and re-inhabited as many times as Jerusalem. Jerusalem was destroyed many more times than any other city you can think about. It was destroyed more times, certainly, than Rome, Paris, any Athens, any city in Spain. I mean, you cannot think about so many times of disasters that happened to Jerusalem. Actually, it was destroyed more than any other place in the world. And actually, the way we modern historians and modern archaeologists read the history of the city is from a destruction to destruction, or from resettlement to resettlement, which follow, each of them following the previous destruction. There is the destruction, there is the conquest of David, then there is the destruction of the first temple, the destruction of the second temple, then there is the destruction after the rebellion against Adrian, the Bar Kokhba rebellion, then there is the Muslim Persian conquest, Muslim conquest, Crusader conquest, and so on and so forth, Ottoman conquest, British conquest, Israeli conquest, whatever. We define the history of Jerusalem as the history of a series of repeated destructions and resettlement of the city. Is it true? Can we interpret the entire history through the political events that affected the city itself? Sometimes it is true. Sometimes when the city was destroyed and re-inhabited, it means a total change in the history of the city. In many other events, the destruction or the conquest or the resettlement was just a continuation of the previous trends in the society of occupation of the country, of the same people living in the same place, the same culture, and other things. And some of the major changes in the history of the city happened during other periods which are not associated with destruction and mega political events. Politics is not the only way to explain the history of a city which throughout history became identified with the abode of the monotheistic God himself. The political events are not the main way of interpreting such a city. Not in the past and not in the present. I will reach the present, don't worry. But I would like to start with the past. Jerusalem became a sacred city according to the Bible during the Davidic time. The Bible attempts to identify the city of Jerusalem with King David. It is kind of a trade marketing of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is described in the Bible as the selected city of a selected king, of a selected people in a selected land and selected country. And the trade marketing of David is apparent also, not only in the Jewish way of thinking about Jerusalem, but in the eschatological thinking of other monotheistic religions as well. Jesus is a descendant of David. All the things that will happen in the last day, the appearance of the Messiah, etc., will occur in Jerusalem itself. This will be the place, even according to Islam, of the last judgment of all the people. But it is interesting to note that the Bible does not mention and even delete any mentioning of Jerusalem before King David. Jerusalem does not appear in the Torah. It does not appear in the first books of the Bible. Almost it does not appear. And there are places in which it should, and you feel, I mean, when Abraham takes his son to the top of one of the mountains, you feel that it should be written in Jerusalem, but it is not. The Bible does not mention Jerusalem in such cases. It appears and it becomes only in the time of David. David is one of the personalities, the most important personalities in all three monotheistic religions. And in some way or another, it is surprising because we have very little remains of the time of King David. King David is very important, but Jerusalem does not contain many remains from the time of King David. We don't see the traces of the temple. Maybe it existed, we don't know. We have very little remains of the time of David and Solomon. It is not the city which is described in the Bible. There is a kind of a tension between the reality, the archaeological reality, and the mythological stories. Jerusalem becomes more important, more influential during the time since the 8th century BCE. And you can see it in the archaeological remains, you can see it in the written evidence, you can see it elsewhere. In the time of the great prophets, the Amos, Hosea, which is apparently also the time of Homer in Greece in the mid-8th century BCE, Jerusalem is becoming a center of learning, of thinking, of influencing. And the Bible undergoes a certain, not the Bible, and the temple is undergoing a certain change and renovation. And here is the beginning of the culture that can be identified with the Jewish monotheistic culture. The books were revealed and were written, and probably the entire Bible began to be written, and the entire Jewish tradition began actually in the 8th century BCE. The archaeology and history are not so important for us, but I would like to describe the beginning of Jerusalem, the identification of a certain site, a certain geographical site, with a transcendental idea of God himself, and with a political in the house of David, which is a political entity. The identification of these three things, the political dynasty, transcendental idea, and geographical site, began to take shape in the 8th century BCE, and actually continued to exist as it was from the 8th century BCE until the 2nd century BCE, with interruptions. I mean, Jerusalem became bigger and bigger during the 8th century, during the 8th century BCE, the 7th century BCE. It was destroyed and abandoned in the 6th century BCE. The Jews returned 70 years later. Jerusalem was a small city, but the idea of the temple, the connection between the ancient ideas which were shaped in the 8th century BCE did not stop until the did not stop and did not interrupted until the 2nd century BCE. This was the temple of God according to the ancient traditions. The way I look at the history of Jerusalem between the 8th century BCE to the 2nd century BCE is of a continuous development of a city which is centered around a temple and around a very strong ideology of the temple. The temple was managed by a certain clan, a certain dynasty of priests, the priests of the Tzadok house of priests. The laws were different from the later periods, and they became stronger and stronger vis-a-vis other rivals to the center of Jerusalem itself. There were other temples in the country. There were other, but there was a constant struggle to keep and maintain the strength of the temple. And the idea of the Davidic dynasty, of the Tzadokian dynasty of priests, of the centrality of Jerusalem, and the idea of the monotheistic God. We usually tend to divide this long period according to political events. We refer to the futile attempt of the Neo-Assyrian Sennacherib attempt to conquer Jerusalem in 701 BCE, in the end of the 8th century BCE. We refer to the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem in 586. We refer to the return of the Jews 70 years later. But culturally, the idea of Jerusalem, for Jerusalem itself, this is a continuous period. And each of these events is utilized in order to strengthen the idea of Jerusalem. It is not the end, it's just a strengthening. The fact that the Neo-Assyrian Empire did not succeed in conquering Jerusalem in the 8th century BCE is a sign that Jerusalem is unconquerable. And even the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem is also temporary, because 70 years later, Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon and create a new empire which is more friendly to the Jews. The idea of an immune city dominated by God and by the political dynasty is strengthened, is not changed so much by the conquest of the city and its destruction. In my opinion, the major change was made during the Hellenistic period, which began, of course, by the conquest of Alexander Magnus, Alexander the Great, who conquered the country, who conquered this country in 332 BCE. Alexander started a period which was very syncretistic period, but the effects of this syncretistic period, of the Hellenistic idea of fusion between the Greek culture and the local cultures, took place only 150 years after Alexander, in 175 BCE. In 175 BCE, this was a major change in the history of the country. It is not so important, the date is not so important, and all the political events that followed are not so important. To make a long story short, in 175, there was a kind of a coup at the Temple of Jerusalem. In the beginning, a certain priest named Yason and then a priest named Menelaos succeeded in buying the high priesthood of the Temple of Jerusalem from the Hellenistic ruler, Hellenistic king, in Antioch, in northern Syria. And it was the beginning of a creation of a different Jerusalem. Jerusalem which is open to other cultures. Jerusalem in which there was, according to Book of Maccabees, there was all kind of Hellenistic institutions, such as Gymnasion, Ephebion, and more important, there was a change in the high priesthood. Instead of the house of Tzadok, which prevailed until then in the temple, there was the beginning of a new high priests with different way of thinking, which did not change even after the success of the Hasmonean revolt against the temporary success of the Hasmonean revolt against the Hellenistic kingdom. It was a change in the heart itself. Everything was changed. It was not the same priesthood. It was not the same. The priests themselves were Hellenistic, were closer to the outer world. It was a fundamental change. I will give just one example. Until 175, the calendar, the Jewish calendar, was a solar calendar. And from 175 onwards, the calendar was changed to a lunar calendar, which was the calendar of the Hellenistic period, especially of Egypt. Egypt, and there was a beginning of new feasts, and later, several hundred years later, the invention of new Jewish feasts like Rosh Hashanah, which was celebrated in the beginning of the Hellenistic year, which is September, October, and not as it was until then in Passover, together with Passover. So the fundamental change, the opening of Jerusalem to the world, began in 175 BC. And the change in the calendar, and the change in this way the people refer to scriptures. The people refer to the outer world change in Jerusalem in 175. And from then onward, for almost 250, maybe 300 years, there was a struggle, a strong struggle within the Jewish people in Jerusalem. The Jewish society was divided into sects fighting each against the other. There were always the Hellenized people, Hellenized priesthood, Hellenized kings. There was the strong majority which became more and more religious, behaving according to strict religious laws. And there were all kinds of groups, many groups, tens of them, fighting against each other, of different types of extremism. How to react against the outer world, how to react against, or not against, how to behave in a way that will please God himself, how to behave in Jerusalem itself. I mean, the period, the later Hellenistic period and the Roman period, were the periods of struggle of the Jewish people centered over the idea that many people thought that Jerusalem is the place in which the strictest behavior of all will prevail, and other people who were more open to the entire world, which become more and more globalized in our terms. From 175, even more from 63 BCE, when the city was conquered by the Romans, and even the time of Herod the Great. Herod the Great in Jerusalem tried to create a kind of compromise. On the one hand, he strengthened the temple. He built the biggest, he not built, because the priests themselves built the temple, but he enabled. He enabled the building of one of the biggest temples of antiquity. He beautified Jerusalem. But he beautified everything outside the temple, including the precincts of the temple itself, were totally Hellenized. I mean, there was the essence, the center was Jewish, the population was Jewish, the architecture was Hellenistic and Roman. It was kind of an attempt to create something which will appeal to both, but it failed. it failed, and the inner struggle between those who wanted the most extremist behavior in Jerusalem, in the abode of God, in the gates of heaven, and all the pilgrims who came from all over the world, all over the ancient world, to visit the temple during the three pilgrimage feasts. They all wanted a very strong, very strict Jewish Jerusalem. On the one hand. On the other hand, there were people who wanted different behavior. The struggle, the mega struggle within the Jewish Israeli society of the beginning of the first century CE, AD, the struggle culminated into open inner war and revolt against the superpower of the world of the time, against the Romans. And I just want to remind, Herod was a friend of the Roman emperors of the time, of Marcus Agrippa, who was the second in charge to Augustus. He calling a city, the city of Tiberias, after Tiberius, who inherited Augustus. Calling Caesarea after Augustus, who was who inherited Augustus, and who was the Kaiser of the time. So there are the biggest cities that he created were totally Hellenized, totally Romans, totally dedicated to the Romans. But not many years after his death, the Jews revolted against the Romans, and as it happens against such empires, it ended with rivers of blood. Jerusalem was destroyed. It is written, Flavius Josephus says that the Romans did not intend to destroy the temple. It was just an accident, but the temple was destroyed. But what I am trying to say is that the destruction of the temple was a major event, but not the most important one. Because during the revolt, during the siege over Jerusalem, there was a creation of something else which affected Jewish people from the year 70 CE, AD, until the mid-19th century. There was the creation of a new type of Judaism. I mean, I refer to a well-known event when Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, he was taken out of Jerusalem as a dead person, and he spoke to Titus, who is going to be the emperor, promising him that he's going to be an emperor, and asking for Yavne ubnotea, Yavne and her daughters, Yavne and her suburbs. And for those who are not acquainted with the ancient and modern geography of the country, Yavne is not an important place. It is just a place. He could have asked for anything else. He asked to go out and to build a new Judaism in a different place. A place which is not trademarked since the 8th century BCE or since King David. A place which is nothing, to create a new Judaism. And new Judaism he created. which was totally different from the previous one. No temple, no sacrifice, no priesthood, no scriptures, only oral traditions, only sages. He took out not the extremist Jews, and he tried to avoid any type of furious discussions. Even intellectual discussions were forbidden. If there is a discussion between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel will prevail. No discussions, no fighting, and no questioning about the calendar, the yearly calendar. Everything was changed. The beginning of the year was moved to Rosh Hashanah. A new feast was created, the feast of Rosh Hashanah. It was in Passover before. Everything was changed. Judaism was changed. But the main effect of the change, and not because of the destruction, but because of what preceded the destruction, was the diminishing place of Jerusalem in the mentality of the Jewish people. The mentality of Jewish people was moved elsewhere. Jerusalem became, instead of the center, instead of the abode of God, a lieu de mémoire, a place of memory. Something like the pictures of my grandparents, something that is there. We remind them, we remind Jerusalem in our feasts. We did not forget it altogether. But since 70, and even more seriously, since the Jewish revolt of the second Jewish revolt of the second century AD, Jerusalem disappeared as a real place from the central thinking of central Jewish thinking. It became a lieu de mémoire. It became something that we think about it. We love Jerusalem. We remind the destruction of Jerusalem, mind you, not the beauty of Jerusalem. We remind ourselves that Jerusalem is destroyed every time. We don't wish to rebuild Jerusalem. Jewish people abandoned the idea of Jerusalem for many years. Even in centuries when it was possible for Jews to come to Jerusalem. Even when a trickle of Jews came back to Jerusalem, say, after, in the end of the 15th century AD, when hundreds and thousands of Jews were expelled from Spain and went, you name it, Constantinople, Aleppo, Edirne, Greece, Romania, wherever. They didn't, only a very small trickle came to Jerusalem. Jerusalem was not, we are trying to convince ourselves that we always dreamed about coming back to Jerusalem. In my opinion, it's an invention of the last 2 centuries. There was Yehuda Halevi, of course. There was the Ramban who came to Jerusalem, of course, to visit, not to settle. Jerusalem was abandoned. And it was rescued. And it was rebuilt, not by Jews, but by other people. First, by the most Hellenistic of Roman emperors, Hadrian, who was very well versed in Greek and in Greek culture. After the destruction of Bar Kokhba revolt, he built Jerusalem again. Of course, he forbade the Jews of coming back to Jerusalem, but this is not the reason why the Jews did not come and did not create a new center of Jerusalem. There was Judaism, went elsewhere, went from a place of cult to the idea of knowledge. It was a different Judaism of the sages, the Judaism of the wise people. Adrian built Jerusalem anew, and Jerusalem was inhabited by Roman people, regular Roman people, who came to Jerusalem, and it was rescued by other monotheistic religions that were more adapted to the Hellenistic world, to the entire world, by the Christian people who built the city anew in the late Roman and the Byzantine period, and the Muslim period, early Muslim period by the Muslims who built the shrines in the Temple Mount. And I will not repeat all the history of Jerusalem. It's a different course, and about the Crusaders, which is my profession, or the Mamluk, in which I am also well versed, and Ottoman periods. I would like to go to the end. Of the same story, and maybe the end of the same story. This is something which is connected to the current Israeli society. The Zionists, the Zionist movement in the 19th century acted along the lines which were very current by the big nationalistic movements of the period. I mean, first choosing a name, choosing a period in the past which befits the movement's ideology and aspiration and hopes and whatever. I mean, just for example, the Greek nationalistic movement, which was created after the liberation of Greece from the Turks, they did not choose the Byzantine period, although all the people in Greece were actually Byzantines. They spoke Greek, they were Christian, Eastern Christians, they were Byzantines. But they created a different past, a more glorious part, which was totally not what the common Greek people believed. They choose the ancient Greek people, the classical period, Athens. The language was different. The aspirations were different. But all the ancient Greek culture was created within Greece itself, and it was possible. And they created a past, a national past, which was centered over the glorious period of classical and archaic Greece. And it was possible to choose a city like Athens, which was just a small village, partially destroyed village in 1831, and to build the capital in Athens. I can repeat what happened to the Turks after the creation of a new country, and so on and so forth. The Jews, when creating their national movement, choose the idea of Zion, which is Jerusalem. It is another name of Jerusalem. It's another name of the Temple Mount. They believed that they can create a new secular movement which will be based on the glorious past when Zion and Jerusalem were the center of the Jewish people, without entering all the madness of people believing that they live where God also lives, or in the abode of God, or people believing that they know what God Himself wants. And there was they created the idea. They created the idea of Zion. They created the idea that we return to this glorious past. When forced to choose the symbol of the country, they choose the symbol of the menorah, taken from the triumphal gate of Titus in Rome, which was a symbol of the destruction. Did not mentioning the fact that Jews abandoned the idea of Jerusalem. Not the locus of Jerusalem, not the location of Jerusalem, but the idea, the very idea of Jerusalem. Believing that we, secular, national Jews, open-minded, we can handle the idea of Zion without falling into the trap, of fundamentalistic Jerusalem. Is it true? Is it really possible to release such a leopard from its cage and to be sure that you can handle it? I am not so sure. One of the division lines of the Israeli societies nowadays, a very serious, and for me personally even frightening, division line, is not between those who leftists or rightists, but between the fundamentalists who want to renew old Judaism, to renew the connections between, to renew sacrifice, to renew the temple, to renew priesthood, to delete 2,000 years of Jewish civilization, and to return to the civilization of the 8th century BC. Maybe to the house of Tzadok, I don't know, but probably the Kohanim. When we come to think about this division line as a central division line, and in my own view, one of the most frightening division lines between the Israeli society, then you can think about different types of cooperation. Who is in one camp and who is located in the other. For example, atheists like myself and Haredi people are in the same camp. Which believes in the eternity of, or in the legacy, at least, of Jewish civilization of the sages and not the civilization of the priests. Whereas the not so Haredi people who believe in the renewal of the temple, the fundamentalists of this kind, are afraid. So the division, both the building of the Israeli society as is, the building of Zionism, and I must admit, there is no Zionism without Zion. It was impossible to find another glorious period in the past which is not a past of Jerusalem with the temple inside it. There is no Zionism without Zion. But there is a threat, and a very a strong threat and a very strong division line within the Israeli society nowadays. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronnie, for this provocative and thought-provoking conclusion for our course. We started this journey with the Zionist movement and the processes of nation building it instigated for the Jews and the Palestinians who came to share a single territory. We wanted to know more about the processes of state and nation building that have taken place in Israel, about the construction of national identity and collective memory, and about the cleavages and conflicts characterizing Israel and constituting a constant challenge for the possibility of creating a single homogeneous society. We have learned that in parallel with this process of nation building, other identities have been constructed as well, national, ethnic, and religious. We saw how these different and other colliding identities led to the establishment of a political system that seeks to bridge these profound divides and how they allow for political representation for the many minorities that constitute Israeli society. We have talked about tradition and modernization, war and peace, and poverty and prosperity. And we were able to start scratching the surface of the rich and profound academic knowledge that has evolved in recent years in the social studies of Israel. I hope that you have enjoyed our journey together and that we were able to provoke your interest. I hope that you are now better equipped to analyze the news coming from Israel and the region, and that you have the initial infrastructure that will allow you to keep enriching your understanding of Israel and its place in the world. If you are taking this course as part of your official academic studies, please do not forget to complete your assignments. Goodbye from Jerusalem.